Welcome back. We'll begin a look at the digestive system and take a look at some of the physiology that is working to digest our food. And we'll start off with just kind of a basic review of the anatomy and take a look and see what we have involved within the digestive tract itself. So the digestive tract, as the name kind of implies, is a tract, and we start out in the oral cavity. And so we take food into the oral cavity. It gets chewed up in there, and then we start to swallow it down through the pharynx and makes its way from there down through the esophagus and into the stomach. Inside that stomach, it's going to churn around for a little while. We're going to mix it on up, and then it's eventually going to leave the stomach and enter into the small intestines. And so from the small intestines, wind back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until it finally gets to the large intestines. As it goes through the small intestines, it's going to go through three distinct regions. And so we have the duodenum, the jejunum, and then the ileum. As it makes its way along the way, it's going to pass through the ileocecal valve, one of many valves we have in the digestive system itself. And that's going to then get our food into the large intestines. Going to come out into the cecum here at the bottom, move up the ascending colon, across the hepatic flexure, and then along the transverse colon to the splenic flexure, the descending colon, down through our sigmoid colon, and then into the end of our digestive tract where it's going to, in a sense, kind of sit there and get compacted and waiting, and then finally out the anus, out the other end. So basically just a big long tube. We stretch it out, it's 25 feet or so in terms of its total length. We've got a large big tube here. Now all along the way it's designed for breaking the food down and getting it to absorb into the body itself. So we've got a lot going on there. And so 6 basic steps for digestion itself, starting with ingestion. We have to get the food into the body. And this is what the mouth is for. And so that food as it comes in, initially as an infant, food is coming in basically already pre-chewed. We don't have to chew it up. We've got kind of mush there, and the food comes into the digestive tract in that way. And so we get it into the body, bring it in there, and start to swallow it down. And so from the mouth, we end up bringing it down via peristalsis to the stomach. And so all along the esophagus, we're going to be using a peristaltic waves to move the food down into the stomach. And then from there, the stomach is going to use peristalsis as well as a segmentation to allow for the mixing of the food that is there as well. And so initially, as we're going into the esophagus, we're going to be using a process of movement that's going to allow us to move our food down along the digestive tract. And this is going to be our peristaltic waves. And so smooth muscle contraction is going to push that food along. We're going to have a series of contractions of both the circular muscles. And so remember that we have 2 layers of muscle. And so we have our longitudinal layer on the outside and then our circular layer on the inside. The majority of the digestive tract has both the circular and the longitudinal layer, with the stomach having that extra oblique layer of smooth muscle. The rest of it all has the longitudinal and the circular layers that are there. And we're going to have a contraction where the circular muscles essentially start to pinch in on the digestive tract itself. And then the longitudinal muscles are going to go through a wave of contraction as well. And that wave of contraction is actually going to be, in a sense, in the opposite direction of the actual movement of the bolus of food, because that's going to allow for that squeezing motion to happen here where the circular muscles are and allow for that squeezing to occur and push that food down towards that end. So in a sense, it's getting thinner and thinner as we move away from the initial site of that contraction. And that brings it along. The circular muscles continue to contract, the longitudinal muscles continue to contract, and we move that bolus of food further on down the digestive tract. In certain areas, we want to be able to do mixing. And so once we get out of the esophagus, food enters into the stomach, and we're going to have a process where we now need to do mixing or segmentation rather than just simply movement. And so in this case, we're going to have, rather than kind of a situation where we get a series of circular fold contractions moving in a pattern going from essentially proximal towards distal, here we're going to have contractions that are occurring in multiple areas. And so the circular muscles themselves are going to be contracting in multiple areas, and that's going to basically move the food back and forth. This is more of a mixing, kind of like a grinding type of a situation rather than for movement. And so this is going to allow us to mix the food up, grind it up some more, make it into smaller and smaller pieces, as well as allow for the addition of digestive enzymes. We can start to get the gastric juices in. We can start to get the enzymes added into the digestive tract to allow for that chemical digestion to occur. So we're going to use a combination of those two movements. From there, we have digestive fluids. And so this is where we have our gastric fluids. This is where we have pancreatic enzymes. We have gallbladder secretions, liver secretions, intestinal secretions that are all bringing in those fluids into the digestive tract. So this adds a little bit of a fluid content in there. And especially if our food is, in a sense, dry, if we're eating crackers or chips or something like that, we're going to need to be able to add some fluid into the process itself. And so those enzymes are going to help with the chemical digestion of our food, as well as for doing things like lubrication, making it so that it's able to be moved along through those circular contractions, and the longitudinal muscle fibers are able to move things along without any kind of abrasion, without any kind of resistance to the movement as it's moving along itself. But the big factor is that it's essentially kind of a big chemical process. And so chemical digestion is the majority of the digestion that we're going to do once we get things broken down mechanically. And for that chemical digestion to occur, it's essentially chemistry. And so we're going to take larger macromolecules and start to break them down into simpler and simpler components. And so we're going to break down our fats, we're going to break down our proteins and our carbohydrates into smaller and smaller subunits, things that we can actually eventually absorb. And so in the end, it's kind of all just chemistry in that process. So for digestion itself, it is a two-pronged effort. We have mechanical digestion, and then we have chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion is fairly obvious when we start to think about chewing. And so we're chewing food in, we're breaking it up. And so imagine like you had a muffin, or you had a chip, even as in the picture. That chip as a whole, if we were to swallow it down, we wouldn't have quite the surface area that we would if we had chewed it up. And so as we take our large piece and chew it, we break it into smaller and smaller pieces. We have the same volume that's there, we have the same quantity, but now it's just into smaller components. So that when we add our chemicals to it, when we add our enzymes, we have something that we can break down and actually absorb. And so now we have our simple sugars, our amino acids, and our fatty acids from this breakdown, and we're able to absorb it. But if we didn't have those big pieces, or those smaller pieces there, we may miss some of that digestion. And so imagine taking that chip and just kind of smashing it up into smaller pieces. We get it into smaller pieces, and then we're going to add some fluids to it. We're going to add those digestive enzymes. Since it's a chip there, we're going to have some starches. Those starches are going to start to break things down initially. And so we're going to break those starches down. We're going to have them in the mouth. We're going to add some salivary amylase. That salivary amylase is going to start to break down the starches in that potato chip. From there, those starches then start to form sugars. We're breaking them down. And you can try this at home. You can take something like just a plain potato chip, or even just like a saltine cracker, and take that chip or the cracker and chew it in your mouth. And once you get it to the point where you kind of think that you're ready to swallow it, leave it in your mouth for a little bit. Kind of mix it around a little bit more, play with it in your mouth in a sense, kind of move it around, mix it with your saliva and things like that. And then think about the taste that you have. And so initially you're going to start out with starches in that chip there. And then we're going to add the salivary amylase to it. And that amylase is going to break down the starches in the chip, and that's going to give us sugars. And so those sugars now, as they're in your mouth, initially you tasted it and it had that taste of starchiness of a potato kind of a thing. But now it's going to start to almost be sweet. And that's because we've broken down some of the larger sugar in terms of the starch and broken it down into simpler sugars that we can taste as being kind of regular sugars. Move it around, especially towards the tip of the tongue, and you'll experience kind of a sweet sensation as it's in your mouth there. So the chemical digestion process itself is going to allow us to take complex carbohydrates and break them down into simple sugars. We're going to take proteins. We're going to break them down into their components as well. We're going to get amino acids, and lipids, we're going to get fatty acids. All through a process where we add enzymes to the food. And as those enzymes then start to break things down, we get those basic components that we can now actually absorb. We're taking those large macromolecules, we're taking the ability to break them down and also liberate from the whole food, in a sense, all of the pieces of the minerals, vitamins, other enzymes that are there in the foods and allowing them to actually be absorbed. And so as we start to bring them into the body, they're going to move from essentially a chemical storage where we've had them stored in larger molecules, and we can bring them into the body as those fatty acids and amino acids and simple sugars as they're entering into the body itself. And so now we have those nutrients there, they're in the body, they're able to be used, and we can supply the body with everything that it needs as far as energy. What's left after digestion becomes waste. And so anything that we're not able to be either digested or absorbed is going to be left as waste. And so in terms of the indigestible component, if we lack an enzyme, so if we have no enzyme for a particular substance, we can't break it down. We're not going to be able to absorb it. And so one of the bigger things that we run across in foods is cellulose. And so when we're eating things like vegetables and fruits and things like that, plants store their sugar away as cellulose. It also becomes a building block of the plants as well. And so that cellulose, we just can't break down. We don't have the enzymes to be able to break down cellulose. So that becomes part of the bulk of the fecal matter that's left after absorption has occurred. And so that's one of the things that we have to eliminate out of the body through the digestive tract itself. And so anything else that cannot be absorbed in terms of the products that are there are going to be left through. And this is where things like even in the diet industry has looked at the ability to make substances not be absorbable. We get like the flavor from it, we get the taste from it, but if we make it unabsorbable, then it's going to just pass through it. And this was done in the past with things like lipids. And so they came up with essentially a lab-based lipid that was there that we were able to put into foods, and you could cook with it and things like that. And it was not absorbable. It could not be absorbed into the body. So it just passed through the digestive tract on its way out. And so since we couldn't get it into the body, we were unable to then absorb it, and it just went through the digestive tract untouched. It wasn't broken down. It wasn't touched chemically. And so it ends up on its way out. The downside to it with these types of fats is that they have the potential to cause some other digestive problems. And so probably the most famous of them was a chemical called olestra, and olestra was initially added to um, the use in like things like potato chips. And so potato chips would use it as the high fat content in there. But the problem was is that since people kind of thought that they were eating something that wasn't really going to be absorbed or anything, they're not getting all the high calories or anything from it. They'd eat the whole can of Pringles, of all the potato chips, which is primarily where the olestra was used. And then they'd end up with digestive upset. They'd end up with diarrhea because it's not absorbable, so your body kind of flushes it out with water. So from here, we're going to start to kind of take a look segment by segment and see what's happening through the digestive process, through each portion of the digestive tract itself. And so we're going to take a trip down through the digestive tract. We're going to start here in the mouth. And so into the mouth goes our food. And into the mouth, we have food that is chewed and mixed with saliva. And so that saliva contains enzymes. It allows us to also lubricate the food as it's coming into the mouth itself. The chewing itself, as we just described, it's going to help to break foods into small pieces. That then increases our surface area. So we've now gone from a small surface area to a larger surface area, which then allows that saliva to start to mix with things. And it's going to, one of the big things that it helps out with is lubrication. Because if the food itself does not contain any kind of starches, that salivary amylase isn't going to be very useful to us at that time. And so it's not really going to do a whole lot for us if we don't have any kind of starches in there. So if you're just taking a piece of meat in terms of your bite, it doesn't have any kind of function there other than more so to lubricate the food as you go to swallow it down. And as I said before, as it does break down carbohydrates, the more that you chew a starchy kind of a food, the more that you're going to get that sweet kind of a sensation coming out of it as it's working in the mouth itself. After we swallow down that one piece of food, saliva is going to continue to help to rinse away food particles. And so it's going to continue to take away those food particles. We're going to continue to salivate after we eat. And not only is it going to help to take away those food particles, but one of the things that's inside our mouth is bacteria. And those bacteria also have, as they are breaking down foods that they find inside our mouth, they oftentimes generate an acidic environment. And so that's going to lead to potential for damage to our teeth. And so the saliva is going to help to buffer the pH that's there. So rather than having our pH falling and falling and falling as those bacteria there are working, it's going to basically keep the pH relatively level. This is part of the reason why when it comes to things like gum, if you read the label on certain gum, you'll find that 9 out of 10 dentists, or 3 out of 4, whatever it happens to be, recommend chewing gum after a meal. And what that's doing is exactly what the saliva is intended to do. It's going to help to rinse away the food particles, buffer the pH, get rid of some of the bacteria that's there, and allow for kind of a cleaner mouth once it's there. The gum will stick to food particles that are in between your teeth, pull them out, not give those bacteria anything to consume on their own. In addition, you're going to continue to salivate, you're going to swallow those things down, and it really kind of cleans up the oral cavity itself because of the saliva that's there. Saliva is also going to rinse away food particles in between each bite. And so it allows us to kind of cleanse the palate as we're moving from one bite to the next. After we've chewed up our food, it's been mixed around with the saliva, it's nice and lubricated, it's ready to come down to the stomach. We're going to swallow it first through the pharynx, and then from the pharynx down into the esophagus. And peristaltic waves are going to allow us to move that food down. And we've got about a foot or so, a little more than that, to get down into the stomach. And so that's going to take a little while. And so anywhere between 7 and 10 seconds or so, depending on the thickness of the food. Things like water are going to move a lot faster down through there. Gravity is helping us. Gravity is also going to help to keep the food down into the stomach once it's there and away from this lower esophageal sphincter. That sphincter that is here to maintain what's inside the stomach, essentially create a one-way valve. Things can come in, but they can't get out. At least that's the way that it's supposed to work. But if you've ever had heartburn, you know that sometimes that content of the stomach makes its way up through that little sphincter. And when it does so, the high acidity of the stomach starts to burn the inside of the esophagus. The esophagus isn't meant for such very high acidic substances to be touching the esophagus itself. And so that can lead to the heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease if it's happening often in terms of time. And this is where, as long as we're upright after a meal and sitting up and standing up, even moving around, that's going to keep any kind of content in the stomach away from that sphincter. And we're going to maintain that it stays down into the stomach and doesn't make its way out. Once we're into the stomach, now we can start to do our mechanical and chemical digestion a little bit more, and that's what we'll begin with next time.